Welcome to the material workshop on building an open source microbial fuel cell. My name is Matthew Halpenny. I'm a bioartist and media artist based in Montreal, Quebec. My work primarily deals with, in the last year and a half, microbial fuel cells, and I'm going to take you through my research creation process of how I got to building the fuel cells, which you can see here. When I started building these a year and a half ago, I didn't really know anything about microbial fuel cells. So when I come at this from a research creation perspective, it's going to come from the basics and work up. And there are many forms of microbial fuel cells. You'll see this one throughout the slides. I'll show you other varieties of microbial fuel cells. And it's usually, these are built by engineers, and what I tried to do is take all the engineering aspects and make them accessible for basically anyone who wants to create these for art or whatever purposes. So this is the layout of what we're going to do. I'm going to talk about microbial fuel cells, and we're going to go through the making process of them and talk about open source. And at the end, I'll talk a bit about the sustainability, because you can see that there's 3D printing, so there's a few things to talk about in that regards, and embodied energy, but that'll be very quick. And then we're going to kind of do a Q&A session. So for examples of microbial fuel cells, we have these artworks. I won't go into detail on all of them because there's a lot of stuff going on here. But you can see there's different types already. We have plant-based ones, like 2 chambers with water and mud. We've got algae reactors, mosses. So I'll take you through all of these and kind of show you how these artists got to where they are. Like I said, they vary a lot. The ones you see in labs are often very small and compact and very efficient. We're going to be trying to not aim for efficiency, but accessibility. So ours won't be as powerful as these ones here, but they'll be much more accessible. They work by harvesting energy in the form of ions from the metabolic processes of anaerobic bacteria. So these are bacteria that live in like the mud and the soil, swamps, etc. And when they break down matter, they produce these ions. These ions act as kind of a residual energy source. So we have stuff like this in batteries, but instead of extracting from the earth to get these batteries, we're taking it from natural environments. So how this ionic energy works is you have a cathode and an anode. On each end of the cell, one of them's exposed to air or water. And it's essentially just the flow of electrons from the metabolic pathways that the bacteria create. And we attach a circuit, and the cathode is going to have reactions with the protons in the soil, and that's going to create a pull that goes through. Yeah, it's a little bit confusing, but also all of this is going to be available in a PDF afterwards. So if you want to read through it by yourself, it's all there. So the electrodes, usually electrodes are pieces of metal, but here we're going to be working primarily with carbon. The reason we use carbon is because it's very porous and it gives the bacteria a place to grow, like all of these threads. So they form biofilms in the threads, which have a much, much greater surface area because we have all of these tiny threads instead of one plate. And the reason we need this is because the ions we're pulling are much less than you would get from a chemical battery. So yeah, as I said, there's many different examples. We're kind of just going to focus on soil-based ones in this workshop, but I have resources at the end of the workshop if you want to further explore for yourself. So this is a floating one, just for an example. We have trees in a pot that's floating in the water, and outside of the pot is a cathode that reacts with the water, and we have a little circuit in there that's going to create energy, and maybe it's powering a sensor network, which is usually what researchers do, but I'll talk more about that later. I'm not going to go into the circuit now, but basically what it's doing is we're getting energy that's around 20 millivolts in the soil. And for reference, much of the digital technologies we use today are 3.3 volts, so we really need to step that up, and that's why we have to create this circuit. I tried my best to find circuits that are fairly pre-made, but oddly, they just don't exist. Researchers do not publish their circuits a lot of the times, but there are a few options you can do with minimal modifications. So the types, we have mud-based, so methanogenic anaerobes. We have plant-based ones, remediative cells, so this uses wastewater for like city sewage systems, etc. And then we have bryophyte-based ones, which are similar to soil ones, and these are the ones that I made. So when we talk about these, it also can be kind of applied to the plant ones as well. So like I said, anaerobic mud ones live in environments without oxygen, so often that's wetlands, swamps, etc. And there's actually methane gas coming out of these swamps from the methogenic bacteria. So it's very like potent and pungent and kind of like a stinky soil to work with, but it's very, very powerful compared to the other ones. So that's an option if you want to do that. Wastewater, not going to go into too much, but it's pretty interesting because there's certain systems that are in place that can take sewage and turn it into electricity within cities. So very interesting research avenue. And then again, bryo MFCs, so bryophytes are like mosses. Mosses aren't the only bryophytes, but they're the ones we're going to focus on. The reason they're interesting for this is they don't have roots, but they have tiny rhizoids, and those rhizoids dig into the carbon electrodes and create a very surface area intense film over the electrodes. So to do this, again, here's the carbon fiber, which we're going to get into later, and you can just grow the moss right on it. Moss doesn't really need soil a lot of the times. It does like certain mixtures, like in this case, they mix the carbon with paper that can decompose, and you get better results when you have some sort of fertilizer or something the bacteria can digest for the mosses to also benefit from. So all of this comes from the approach of critical making and open source. Why are we building these microbial fuel cells? Well, for one, they are a very interesting revenue of energy research that doesn't extract from the earth. It's much slower, but throughout the years, it can maybe provide a more sustainable energy system. And as creators and artists and non-engineers, it's kind of important to go through this cycle because a lot of the sustainable energy systems that are put in place today are behind closed paywalls and certain companies that own rights to these systems. And as a public consumer, we don't really get a say in how the design process works. So by creating it, we get to learn more about it. We get to create new things, suggest new designs, and hopefully influence the sustainable energy market. Pretty much more of what I just said, but this design here, I'm going to post a link in Swapcard after, or you can always contact me for it, and it has a PDF of this presentation and actually the printer cells files for these cells. So I'll get more into how to use those in a sec. And of course, this is like a very complicated process to create these. So each one, like the printing and the electrodes and the electronics could take an hour by themselves. So we're just going to kind of dot the points and give you avenues to explore instead of kind of digging fully into it. And then there's more resources at the end that you can explore, but hopefully this saves a lot of time if you want to make microbial fuel cells because you know where to look and what to do. So this cell here is the open source design that you're going to be able to print. And you have your two anodes, or the anode and cathode, your cell body, and then you have this thing at the bottom, which I'll get into, that basically fixes the cathode to the bottom where there's an air hole. Transparent lid or semi-transparent lid is kind of important because you want some light to get through to your mosses or plants. So this is kind of like the process we're going to go through. I'm going to talk about how I printed these or how you can upcycle them with plastic containers. And then kind of very quickly talk about how you can design them yourselves or modify the designs. Electrodes and electronics after that. So the cell body varies very much from different cells. Of course, like we have water-based ones, which are going to have kind of systems like this where you close off both sides and then you have electrodes in the middle so water can't escape. We're not going to be really talking about that. We're more of the ones where you have kind of like a pot that your plants sit in. And you can make these pots also, yeah, like I said, out of Tupperwares or different plastics. But the efficiency kind of is semi-important. So I'm going to talk about how to do it in a way where you'll actually get energy from it. One of the images I showed earlier is an art project called Moss FM, and this is the actual sketch from that project that they supply for free. So this cell right here that I built is based off of that. And you can also build a cell just like this if you want. I 3D printed it, but it's very easy to make a container. So these are my very first examples. So if you want to know where to start, like this is theirs. They also have a plastic container that looks fairly upcycled, just bolts from the hardware store. Stainless steel mesh, which I'll get into again, but you can just buy it at any hardware store. So yeah, printing them. I'm going to talk a little bit about this. I'm also going to start, I don't know if you noticed in the open source section, but I'm going to have icons here at the top so you know which section we're talking about, because everything kind of blends into each other. So the gaskets are that part that I mentioned before. Just gonna, this one has it open. It's this here, and it's important you have gaskets on the bottom. So it's kind of hard to see, but it's in there. And what that does is it allows you to tighten the cell really tight so that the cathode at the bottom has no air that can escape out of the cell, and that way it's forced to go through the electrode. As you can see, it's kind of hard to cut. Like mine's not very pretty, but you can also laser cut them, which is a little more complicated, but it's an option. For nuts and bolts, one thing to consider is if you're using metal, make sure it is waterproof, because otherwise it's going to ruin your electrodes when it oxidizes. Even like galvanized screws, like these ones, will oxidize a little bit and ruin your electrodes. So I've also included 3D printable screws that you can print, and these are completely waterproof and they won't rust. And you can make these yourself in the design program I'm going to show you later. Lids, I won't go too much into this, but you kind of want to have it semi-transparent, so you need to look for transparent filaments, but they're going to print like this, and it's going to let in some light, but not a lot. If you want it to let in more light, you have to coat it with special chemicals that will create a flat surface instead of the striations that printers create. You can also make it out of transparent vinyl and do something like Velcro on the sides to create a little greenhouse. So the 3D printing section, again, not everyone's going to have access to 3D printers, so if you don't, that's okay. It does make things a lot easier because you can make things very airtight, which is important for these cells. And as you can see here, you can print the entire cell in just one go. If you don't have access to a printer, you can usually find them at maker spaces if you live in a city, universities, libraries, etc. You can also order prints from people online. Or if you are going to do a lot of research with printers, you can buy a cheap printer for up to $300, but you probably want to buy one that's not too finicky, because these printers, the cheap ones, can be a lot of technical learning slopes, but some of them are catered for people who don't want to do the technical stuff. These are the different kinds. We're going to be talking about FDM, which just goes layer by layer, like this on the left. There's also resin if you want to get into that, but we're not going to talk about resin. They usually use PLA. You can use different filaments. There's PETG, ABS, there's flexible ones, but PLA is mostly compostable, so that's a plus. I'm going to talk about that in the sustainability section because it's a bit of a, it's a little greenwashed, but there are options that aren't. I'll leave this here if you want to come back to the PDF to learn which things are the printer, but they have 3 motors. When you print, the bed just aligns itself to where the extruder is, or the bed goes one way, the extruder goes another way. And it essentially goes line by line, layer by layer, and then moves upwards. To do this, you need STL files. I supply you STL files in the link I'm going to send. Basically, all that is a file that will show the geometry of the object, but to get it on a printer, you also have to turn it into G-code. So each printer is going to have slicers. There's one called, did I put it in here? Yeah, Cura, which works with many, many printers, and it's free. A lot of printers are also open source, like Prusa, and it means you can modify things, or there's a big community that can help you if anything goes wrong. So some researchers already have started doing this. This is a wastewater cell I found. I couldn't actually find the file, but they said it was accessible. But yeah, again, you can just print it, and it saves you a lot of time and cost, because these things can be quite expensive from lab grade suppliers. This is again the cell, which I'm going to show you how I designed that object, because this is actually from the design program. So if you want to get into that, you have to use like a CAD software, and it's a little complicated to get into, so this one is really short. But I use Fusion 360. It's free for hobbyists and makers. It essentially lets you design the cell kind of like in a 3D program, but you can go back to steps and modify your screw size, your hole size. You can delete objects, import objects, etc. It's much more accessible for when you have many different parts. Pretty much said that. So this is the software. Again, you have all the parts on the side, and you can go back in the timeline and change things very easily. You can import object by object to print. So if you're thinking about doing this and you want to use a 3D software, like maybe avoid Blender and go for this option, just because you're working with so many different parts. So for the electrodes, again, we're going to be using carbon ones mostly. These people here are making a giant powerhouse out of hundreds of these, and they're just using Tupperwares and mud that they found in a swamp. And again, you can see all their noses are plugged because it does really smell this stuff. These are the materials. If you're making your own, activated charcoal is going to be the one we're going to use. You can find it at pet stores because it's used in aquariums, so it's very easy to get. The other ones I'm going to talk about are carbon paper and graphite felt, which are a little harder to get a hold of. Graph oil, carbon fiber brush, not used in this design, but also electrodes. Graphene is super, super efficient, but expensive, and not really worth it for this stuff. Yeah, again, so they're really good because they're porous, but they're also rust resistant, which is important. You have to be careful when buying it too, because carbon has many forms, or in chemistry it's called allotropes, and some are more conductive than others. So you want to stick to like aquarium grade activated charcoal, for instance. And if you do use charcoal, you're going to use this method, or this method is the easiest. You just use a mortar and pestle. So step by step, you're going to take the carbon, you're going to crush it in a pestle till it gets to a very fine powder. Then you're going to take a stainless steel mesh, which you can get from a hardware store. They're used in windows and gardens. You're going to cut it in a circle, and be careful when cutting it because it is really sharp and it can kind of prick your finger. You might want to use gloves or use big metal snips, but you can just use it with sharp scissors. Then you want to take the charcoal and fix it to the surface of the cell, so you can use epoxy to do that. But because we need it really, really tight to touch the stainless steel, you also want to clamp it. If you don't have a hydraulic pump, like I did not, you can use just a C-clamp and some pieces of wood or scrap, etc. If you are a car owner, you might have a hydraulic pump, and you can adapt it for this. You want to let the epoxy dry, and then when that's done, you can put it in your cell. I also forgot to say that you want to affix a wire in the epoxy that's touching the stainless steel, because that wire is going to run out of your cell. So like you can see here, the wire is attached to the cathode at the top, then it comes out of the cell. The anode is the same thing, but it's buried at the bottom, so you have a gradient that moves upwards. You can get lab grade ones. I often use lab grade ones because they're easier. They eliminate one aspect of the process that's difficult because you know they're going to work. Sometimes when you make your own electrodes, something could go wrong. Maybe it's not pressurized enough. Maybe the charcoal's not right. So if you want to just start off knowing that it's going to work, you can try and find these. They're very hard to source. I get them from the States. Where you are, it's going to be different. But they're also expensive to ship because they're lab grade stuff and there's import duty and whatnot. But yeah, you can use felt and paper. And the felt's really good because it's like this thick, spongy material and the rhizoids or the roots can grow right into it. You can also put holes in it that let plants like sit inside of it. The carbon paper is much thinner. I have one here, and this kind of goes in the fixture that attaches it to your cell. Putting these in your cell, you can use two methods. Again, we have the stainless steel from the hardware store. All you need to do is kind of clamp it in. So you put it in between this with a rubber gasket, and you just sandwich it as tight as you can get. You can also use conductive thread, which is the next method, but you can combine them to kind of staple it or like sew it into the stainless steel. And that way you have a lot more contact. You can buy this stainless steel thread online in places like Adafruit or different suppliers. You can use it in sewing machines too if you want to be really thorough about it. You can do it by hand. I really like this method because it doesn't hurt as much if you accidentally touch it. And you can sew it right in, attach it to wires, and you don't really need to worry about it as much. You can also crimp on different connectors like DuPont's. I have one in here, and it just lets you like plug right into it. And the reason that this is handy is because these are not very strong. And as I'll talk about later, you kind of need to chain them together to get enough energy most of the time. Because we're not using lab grade efficiency, we make up for that with usually quantity, like 3 or 4 or as many as you want. And again, just to reiterate, this will all be available to you after. If you're not following along, it is going very fast. So yeah, you can see it later if you want. But to just pause for a second, what I was saying about connecting, you can see that these artworks this is a chain of probably 30 microbial fuel cells in each stack, all chained into a center kind of bioreactor. Again, you have all these wires chaining them together. Over there we have 10 MOS batteries that are powering a radio. And then the electronics. So this part's also the most diverse. It's really going to vary depending on what cell you're building, how much energy you're getting out of it, etc. So I'm kind of just going to go through the easiest route to build one. And I have an example here. We're going to talk about this prefabricated energy harvesting chip. And all you have to do is add a few components and you can use that. But you're going to have to code it in whatever language is most comfortable to you because you have to pair it with a microcontroller. So these chips are meant for energy harvesting, which is what microbial fuel cells do. And energy harvesting is just using residual energy from the environment. So wind, solar, heat differentials, and in this case, soil ions. And it's usually very low voltage. This one's considered ultra low because it's so small. And you need to use special boards, but They're very hard to find. A lot of them, there's a lot of boards that came out in like 2014-ish and they disappeared. This one's still available, super cheap. It was like $8. I think this is probably the best route to go, the LTC 3108-1. I also have the data sheet for it included in the resources, because otherwise you might be just really chasing down so many revenues of discontinued chips. This is considered a power management circuit. So it's just all the components you need to attach to your microcontroller. You have input from your cell here, oops, and then you have a microcontroller on the other side. So the parts in this, you're going to have to always buy a transformer, which is this tiny little square. You can see it there. Those are the ones that you use with the LTC 3108-1. We're using the 1:100 ratio one. So again, you can come back and look through these sheets if you want to build your own. I did at one point in my research creation want to build my own circuit, open source, to have it available for people, but that's still a ways away. These things are supercapacitors. They're kind of going to be the energy backup. So when you're harvesting energy, you have to dump it somewhere because you're not supplying the microcontroller with energy all the time. These, if you're stepping up like 1 millivolt to 3.3 volts, obviously it's not sustainable to just pull it all the time. You kind of have to slowly build it up in a battery and then discharge it. Or not a battery, sorry, a supercapacitor. You can use batteries, but these are easier. And basically they're all going to be 5.5. That works, it's okay, as long as your voltage isn't above the rated one. And I'm going to show you exactly how to hook it up, that you can come back to this. You have parts on that board. In the data sheets, it shows you the pins, and these are what you connect. So you can just go step by step, like, okay, I need a capacitor here. You need a capacitor here. I say this all later. You have to connect the LTC 3108 in a certain configuration. It takes some time to fiddle around with and get, but it really is all step by step if you take this route. You just have to follow the steps and you'll get it working. You can refer to this one if you come back to it. It tells you kind of what everything does and where to plug it. This is the first one I built. You can just do it on a breadboard like this. Although I recommend soldering it to a PCB at some point, a proto board at some point, because these leak voltage a little bit, and since you're using such low voltage, that can be a problem. Microcontrollers, common ones, ESP, ESP32. STM's really good. They have this one called the Blue Pill you can use because it works with Arduino, and most people know Arduino, so that's kind of the maker community usually uses this one. And to talk about batteries, MFCs kind of want to replace batteries at some point, and a lot of researchers use them as remote sensor networks that harvest energy from the environment. No batteries, just environmental energy, and then they send data off to a research center by themselves. That way they never have to go in the environment and disturb it. It just constantly gets energy and sends it out. Those MFCs are kind of tricky, so what we're going to do in this case is just use a very small battery to minimize our impact. That's another approach that researchers use, but it's kind of the simpler approach. All it does is it supplies your microcontroller with energy at all times. It's going to be hibernating, so it's going to use very little, and this can probably last up to like 3 years sometimes. But your controller is going to go to sleep. It's going to wake up at a certain point. This can actually tell it to wake up. That's in the data sheet. But yeah, it's going to be sleeping. It's going to wake up. It's going to say, okay, we have energy, and it's going to send it off to your sensors, your LEDs, whatever you want to power with your MFC. Again, yeah, the controller can tell you how to do it. I'm just going to leave this here because there's some more stuff to get through. But as I was saying, it's very slow. So in this research in 2014, this is the first kind of paper that I read on microbial fuel cells that made sense to me. They have two capacitors, and basically they're using the second capacitor to charge their sensors and their radio signals that they're sending out to the research stations. It takes 31 hours for the first one to go off, and then 12-hour intervals, which is actually pretty good for microbial fuel cells. So we're really talking slow. And to get these to work, the biofilms have to grow into the electrodes. So they actually take time to kind of foster, and you need to care for them for like a month or so before you get good results, which is also why I built this, because you have the enclosure. Mosses just need humidity inside and like a little felt to grow on, and you can just leave them like this by themselves for however long you need. It's good to check on them once in a while, but yeah, you're gonna need to wait, which is also something that I find very interesting about microbial fuel cells from a theoretical point of view, because we're so used to this fast-moving society and all our electronics working faster and quicker and more efficiently. But even with sustainable technologies, they need probably longer times usually, and we're expecting them to produce as much energy as we're using now. But we're still using this energy paradigm that's based off of industrial standards and extracting from the earth the coal and oil and burning it, and it operates on a different time scale than maybe what is sustainable. To be sustainable, maybe we need to go slower instead of making technologies to compensate for what we're losing in extractive technologies. Some challenges you might face, again, you're going to need to chain them probably. That's easy to do, especially if you're printing them. It takes a lot of the work out because you just print one after the other. If you have a big printer, you can print multiple at a time. You want to check on a multimeter probably how much voltage you're getting, so you can test as the cell's growing how much is there. You need to put it basically on the lowest setting to be able to get anything, and even then it's probably going to be in the decimal points. To actually get a really good reading, you need specific equipment, but you can do it with a hobbyist multimeter and power supply. Right, and also if the current's not going super high, could be your electrodes are too far apart. It's better if they're closer. And it could be that if you made your own, there's not enough surface area in the carbon that was crushed. So kind of what I just talked about with extractive technologies. There's a lot of greenwashing going around with sustainable technologies, and some of them have more energy put into their production and their electronics than they'll ever save from burning oil. So things like solar panels are not always, offsetting carbon because it takes so much energy to build them, and that energy comes from oil. So we need to kind of look at the manufacturing process, and there could be issues with these because they're electronics, but it's hard to avoid that. It's just something that, to be aware of with sustainable technologies, because it's not a save-all just using these. Yeah, and on that note too, plastics. So as I said, there's a lot of greenwashing even with plastics. So they say PLA is compostable because it's made from cornstarch. But the thing is, you need to use very specific equipment running for like a year long just to get it to decompose. And that takes a lot of energy. There are options that are fully biodegradable with less intense composts, but they all kind of require some specific equipment, except for one, PLA. So this new PLA is biodegradable by its own, 100%. You can use composters, or it can just be in a bioactive environment. So if you threw the filament in a swamp, it could digest it. I'm not suggesting you do that, but this thing is fully biodegradable. It's pretty new, so you might not be able to get a hold of it, but options are coming along. This one's more accessible. It's very cheap if you want to start printing. It's still hard to compost, but they plant a tree for everyone, and that kind of offsets carbon over time. I mean, there's issues with carbon offsetting instead of avoiding carbon emissions, but at least this is a better option than your other ones. You can also recycle filaments. I'm not going to talk about that fully, but there is a resource in how to build your own recycler, open source recycler in the resources. So when you get this PDF, you're going to have all of these resources available to you. And if you ever have questions or need more information, you can contact me. I'd be happy to help you out. And that's it. Thanks.